my dear and trusted colleagues.
There is only a handful of directors with a really unique visual style. You probably recognize those first shots as the work of Wes Anderson.
What?
But this one was directed by a man who will only be familiar to the most seasoned persons among you.
Don't you recognize him?
He did look familiar.
Afraid to make it too effective. That's also a risk. You make it more similar to how movies normally are made.
Being ordinary isn't something these two directors should fear. Besides the majority of their last name, they share an aesthetic more distinguishable than a signature. But that wasn't always the case.
All right, hit it!
Wes Anderson's first work was a black and white short film, without most of the trademarks of what makes a Wes Anderson movie a Wes Anderson movie. And back in the 60s, Roy Anderson was making political documentaries, before he directed a Swedish love story.
I tried to change the style with my second movie, and that was an enormous flop.
His earlier style was closer to
style like the Zika,
who's also a big influence for Wes.
The neo-realist through the Fellini period.
In his work in advertisement, Roy Anderson developed a style closer to Fellini.
Abstracted description of life.
They're both inspired by the work of the Italian neo-realists. But these days, their work looks nothing like it. Or does it? No, it doesn't, but there's some similarities. These movies are not shot in a documentary style. They don't avoid ornamental mise-en-scène. They're not shot on location. They definitely do not shine for their use of natural lighting or hands-off directing. But in the acting, there you'll find parallels. The work of neo-realists usually employs non-actors. More than performers, they were for De Sica a silhouette, a face, a way of walking. Roy uses a lot of non-professional actors because
När en amatör blir rätt och bra, då får den amatören ofta in den här processen, de här dimensionerna i spelet.
For the same reason, Wes uses a lot of first-time actors.
Lights! Camera!
It was the last day it was literally the last day that we saw kids. I mean, after he came in that day,
do you believe in God?
And I knew instantly.
What they're looking for in the acting is a naturalistic quality that will ground their stylized world into reality. While Roy's work draws a lot more parallels with Italian neo-realism, the three of them employ artifice. If you go back to the shooting of The Bicycle Thief, for example, there are accounts of De Sica rehearsing his child actor again and again and again. Because to create that style of realism, De Sica had to frame reality. And to do that, he couldn't escape artifice. Instead of pursuing the reality of the physical world, the Andersons are looking for some sort of truth in an intangible and immaterial one. And to understand what these worlds are, it's important to look at how they are. Both directors' work have a few similarities. Their characters are archetypal, and most of the time, they seem unable to show genuine emotion.
I'm fine, thank you.
Vad roligt att höra att ni har det bra.
In Wes' case, that creates rare moments where the character's humanity finally shines through.
I've had a rough year, Dad.
I know you have, Chazzy.
They also share an uncommon obsession for detail, so scenes that
last for one line, we have to build the set just for that one scene.
From the beginning, Wes had it in his mind that we would be building the boat in some way. We've built it in cross-section. It's 150 feet long. It's long.
For The Life Aquatic, Wes built something that didn't really exist in reality. Roy, on the other hand, put something together so it wouldn't look like reality. When he built a train station instead of renting one at a fraction of the cost, he invested 2 whole months to create this scene, from conception to rehearsals to the shooting and then to the final product.
Det som är riktigt sant ska se ut falskt, och det som är falskt ska se ut sant.
That artificiality they're talking about is also conveyed in camera angles. Both are partial to what David Bordwell calls planimetric composition, which describes when the camera stands perpendicular to a rear surface and the characters are strung across the frame. Because the image looks flattened out, it has a deadpan comedy look, which is often harnessed by having things enter the frame on the left side or the right side. Then we have what they read. Both Andersons have been heavily influenced by the work of early 20th century exiled writers. Understanding these influences brings you one step closer to understanding their aesthetics. For Roy, it's the Peruvian Cesar Vallejo. We'll get back to that in a while. For Wes Anderson, it's the Austrian
Stefan Zweig.
The biggest thing they have in common is the way they look at the past. Wes Anderson's work fits under the umbrella of nostalgia film, a term coined in the 1970s about movies like American Graffiti, Chinatown, or The Conformists, movies that tried not only to recapture the past, but to reinvent it. Instead of the traditional historical film that attempts to recreate the past as it was, these movies gratify a nostalgic desire to return to that older period. Wes Anderson achieves that by reinventing the past to arouse feelings of melancholia. He created an anachronic New York, riffing on the 50s writing of J.D. Salinger, the music of the 1960s.
It's against the law.
In the 1970s, he made up an island and set it in 1963.
The year is 1965.
And in 2014, he traveled to Germany and Poland to create the former Republic of Dubrovka, once the seat of a great fictional empire in two very real wars. Reimagine. Stefan Zweig was a first-hand witness to those wars. By the 1930s, Zweig had become the most translated writer of his time, and you'd had to be out of your mind to think he could be stopped.
Das glaube ich und das weiß ich.
Schließen Sie mir bei, wenn ich sage, dass Deutschland einen Krieg vorbereitet und sich auf den Sieg in die Barbarei befindet.
Yeah, fuck it.
In a 1935 interview, he talks about the division of
the continent into borders that require documentation.
Documents, please.
To be crossed even after the First World War, and how all of these prescriptions on travel had become even more ferocious.
Zweig couldn't live with that loss of freedom. In his suicide letter, he described the feeling of losing the world of his own language. His spiritual homeland had destroyed itself. The world he lost was one of culture, was a world of manners.
She's charming. She's so charming.
Of beauty. He was a far-flung witness of the destruction of a
culture that he had completely handed himself over to. It was his whole life was this world of art.
And that showed in his writing. He had a longing for the past, a past that he painted in such bright colors that it perhaps never existed. A memory of a fantasy, words used by Wes to describe Moonrise Kingdom. In the case of Zweig, I think looking at the past, he chose beauty over historical fact. And the way he tells many of his stories is a strategy that helps him color the past. Usually someone...
some hotel, someone who's away from their normal life.
I beg your pardon?
Meets a mysterious stranger. And
I know and admire your wonderful work.
And some things happen, and finally that person says, well, let me tell you my story. And that's...
It begins, of course, with...
This adds an extra level of narration. And for a storyteller, that creates incredible freedom. Because now, for example, the narrator can be conditioned by a character's willingness to tell part of his story.
You see, I never speak of Agatha because...
He can color in the details. The way people dress, the way people move, the way people talk.
On a broken down saloon piano in the outskirts.
If you're a nostalgic, you can make a hyperbole of what was good and use a single sentence to describe all that was bad.
What happened in the end? In the end, they shot him.
Wes Anderson not only did this, but he added several other layers. We not only have the writer and the mysterious man, but also the old writer, decades later, describing the incidents not
exactly as I present them here,
but approximately as he kinda remembers them. And this all starts with the young reader clinging to her book. I think that's where the story takes place. It exists in memory. In theater, Tennessee Williams called it a memory play. His memory takes a lot of poetic license. It omits some details, while others are exaggerated,
precisely
according to the emotional value of the article it touches. The Grand Budapest Hotel exists in the memories of that young girl who read a book by an old author, remembering a story of when he was young, and met another old man who was himself remembering when he was even younger. The reality of what happened is so far gone by now that if you try to recreate it, all you'd have left would be an imitation. Instead, Wes Anderson not only assumes, but fully embraces the artificiality of memory, because in this story, that's all that's still real. Roy Anderson's aesthetics also depict something immaterial.
and in a wholly unexpected way.
Cesar Vallejo wrote that a person's life is revealed in its entirety in a single one of her actions. If you know the one action, you know the truth about her life.
Ja, vad ska jag svara?
But for both Roy and Vallejo, the actions that define you aren't grand displays of heroics.
Yeah, I hear you.
But things like polishing your shoes, putting on your jacket, or, you know, the little things.
Things that bring us together. Things that point out our similarities instead of our differences.
With his filmmaking, Roy attempts to capture what he describes as trivialism. He claims the most philosophical questions of our time come into focus in the most banal and absurd moments of everyday life. To capture those moments, he decided to exaggerate, to make things larger than life. Like Wes, instead of imitating reality, he works from what he remembers from reality. Because, he says, by reconstructing that memory, we'll lose a lot of details. You will purify and condense it. But his memories are very different than Wes Anderson's. He doesn't look melancholically to the past, but bleakly at the future. Wes moves his camera a lot, goes left and right, goes up and down and all around. But Roy, well, he sets a camera on a tripod and points it at mostly static tableaus in long takes with wide-angle lenses. The light is soft and shadowless, illuminating everything all the time, leaving the characters with their faces painted white, completely exposed. The sets are minimalist and monochromatic, and they're made to look bigger, not through CGI, but by using a method called
trompe-l'œil, alltså bedra ögat, lura ögat. Någonstans så känner man kommer att känna att det här är analogt. Och det är, hur den är så ligger det någonstans respekt inne i det här som kommer stråla ut i slutresultatet.
The respect he looks for with analog technique also informs his decision not to use
close-ups are not as interesting as wide shots, because there are so many things in a wide shot that you have to look at carefully to understand the picture.
Because if you look too close at someone, you lose its context. But if you take a step back and look at a wide shot, you'll better understand what you're looking at. All of this makes up the complex image. It doesn't rely on the editing or shot variation to present new information or direct your focus. All you need is either in the frame or will soon be. You can see that in this sequence from Roy's latest. You can spend its length focusing on the main action, starting with the lovely limping Lotus singing and passing around shots for shillings. Soldiers join in to sing of their financial unrest. And then Lotte comes to a decision. As an alternative, you can also spend the 4 minutes this scene lasts, wondering about limping Lotte's lingering looks to the man in center frame. And what kind of relationship do these two have? Or you can scan the picture continuously and notice that the staff has started to come out of hiding and marvel at this scene. Here, it's your mind that does the editor's work, because you get to decide on where your attention takes you. What Anderson does with a complex image is to compel you to look and listen closer, turning you from a passive observer into an active one. And that's completely different from a scene shot in a classical way. In Schindler's List, everything from narrative to characterization, at first glance, seems realistic. The characters scream in fear, and you empathize with their pain. You see close-ups of naked actors, accurately characterized. You suspensefully await for either water or Zyklon B to pour from the ceiling. And then you feel the relief these characters must have felt. Steven Spielberg plays on your emotions, and that, Roy would argue, blinds you to reality. In Anderson's short film A World of Glory, a child also screams. But you see it in the distance. You're not manipulated into feeling for the stand-ins, for the Holocaust victims. Because of his aesthetic, the audience is deprived of emotional involvement, creating intellectual engagement. For Roy, that's the truest way to look at such an event.
Fantastic.
Both Andersons represent the world in unconventional ways, and that might dissuade their audience to look beyond their aesthetics. But if you do that, you're missing something. Cinema comes in many different shapes, but none escape artifice. So instead of artifice masked as reality, let us also praise artifice without remorse.
Eller vad säger du? Ni hinner ta en rökpaus efter.